Hey everybody, it's Josh. I want to do a video, and this is going to be as summarized as I can get it. Because as a young Christian, which I still am, I've only been studying the Bible for about 9 months now. I am far from an expert, but you will come across people who will challenge you with the harder verses, especially in the Old Testament. Usually this is what the atheists do, or the non-believers. They will memorize these harder verses, which I mean, people say that God calls for genocide and just killing all of a certain people, which in times he does call for wiping out an entire people. But you have to understand what is going on. You have to understand the context. You have to understand the covenant and relationship God has with the people at the time. And you have to understand, even though we live in the 21st century, this happened most of it 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. So this is the life of before even the Bronze Age people. This is the life of people in a world that was so corrupted and so immoral that, well, God had to often take extreme measures in extreme conditions. So the first thing that I want to talk about today, and the main thing I want to focus on, is the Amalekites. The Amalekites, we don't know a whole lot about, except for they were most likely descendants of the Nephilim. Now, the Nephilim were giants. They were monstrous people. They were like this because the fallen angels, Satan's minions, came down and were laying with the women. And the Nephilim were the offspring of these women. Now we see in the time of Noah's flood how extreme it got. God flooded the entire world to wipe out these Nephilim. Now you can take it literally, you can take it figuratively, you can say it was the known world at the time. We absolutely know from not only studying the geology and archaeology and things like this, but mainly from studying religions. 167 religions talk about the Great Flood. So, most likely, it happened. Now, was it covering the entire world? Most likely not. But that wasn't the point. The point was God had to wipe out this spiritual threat. It wasn't just a physical threat, it was a spiritual threat. The Amalekites, descendants of the Nephilim, from what we believe, they called them giants. But what we know is how bad the Amalekites were. The Amalekites, when Moses was freeing the Israelites from slavery in Egypt, they got to the desert and stayed there for a long time. So long that many of the Israelites were like, we were better off in slavery. We were better off staying there where at least we were fed, at least we had shelter. Yes, we were treated horribly, but at least we weren't starving to death. As Moses and the Israelites were crossing the desert, trying to find the land that they would settle in, which was Israel, the promised land, They were attacked unprovoked by the tribe called the Amalekites. Now, the Israelites ended up winning these battles, but God was not happy. God said they will be cursed, and in due time they would be wiped out. But God, when he said a group was cursed, when he said a tribe was cursed, he did not wipe them out altogether right away. If you look at, I believe it was Genesis 15, the covenant of God with Abraham. God told Abraham that you will inherit the land of Israel, but it will be 400 years before you do. Your descendants will inherit it. And why is this? Because a tribe called the Amalekites, I know there's a lot of terms going around, and you have to study this intensely to understand every action that God took. And then you still won't understand the plan of God. If you think you're going to understand the plan of God, then you're sadly mistaken. But he allows us to know why he did the things he did in the Old Testament. So he said that the inequities of the Amalekites were not coming to fruition until after 400 years. And this is a theme that we see over and over in the Bible. And actually we see it outside of the Bible. And I'll tell you that here in a little bit, hopefully, if I remember. That God lets a tribe or a certain group of people basically fall on their own. He is not going to destroy them until they are completely corrupted, until they are completely to the bone corrupted. And what do I mean by corrupted? It's not just that they do not worship him. It is that they sacrifice children at the altar of gods like Moloch and Baal. It is that they engage in immoral sexual acts, often within their own family, things I'm not allowed to say on YouTube, but they were attacking people, just like the Amalekites, unprovoked. They were making war with people, neighboring tribes, neighboring cities, unprovoked, constantly. It got so bad that when they were finally, the fruits of their iniquities were finally ripened to that poisonous fruit, then they were finally wiped out. But again, it wasn't just that the Amalekites, the one I'm focusing on today, it wasn't just that they were attacking the Israelites as they were fleeing from Egypt. That was what initially started them to where God said they would be wiped out. But God already knew the outcome of everything. And so he waited hundreds of years, centuries, until they were so completely corrupted that every man, woman, and child in the city, there was no hope for them. There was centuries of just this awful behavior, just this evil behavior. And so, after the 400 years, well, after not quite the 400 years, you get to the time of King Saul, who was the king when David was a young shepherd, and they were fighting. You know, David and Goliath. David fought the giant and became one of King Saul's greatest generals. Now, once again, the Amalekites attacked King David and the Israelites unprovoked. So King David, the great general that he was, beat them, just like Moses and the Israelites beat them before. This time, God had said, it is finally enough. They are finally corrupted to the core. There is no saving them. And so he instructed King Saul to take out every man, woman, and child, and even the animals, because it was time for them to be wiped off the face of the earth. We say, how could you do that? That's genocide, right? Okay, so when you have a culture like the 1930s and 40s Germany, which another thing I'm not allowed to say on YouTube, when you have a culture like this, what is it that you do? Do you allow them to just fester in their evilness? Do you allow their evilness to become so ingrained in their culture that they are irredeemable? Or do you take care of the problem? Do you go to war? And when you go to war, and it is so corrupted that the children of these tribes are raised in this and taught this from the youngest age. The ones who weren't sacrificed at the altar, for sure. They're taught these evil ways at such a young age that even the children had to be put to death. Now, the same goes with Sodom and Gomorrah. With Sodom and Gomorrah, it teaches us why it is important that all of them be wiped out. Because if you remember, in Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham was pleading with them, please, if you can find righteous people in this city, will you please spare them? And God said, if we can find, 400 righteous people. And Abraham talked him down to 10. If you can find 10 righteous people, will you please spare them? And God said, okay, if we can find 10 righteous people, we will spare Sodom and Gomorrah. I will spare them. And so the angels went to Sodom and Gomorrah. They were looking for 10 righteous men when they were surrounded by all the men in the city, most of the men in the city. And the men wanted to have their way sexually with them. Show them who's boss, because you're an outsider. You come here, we're going to do that to you. And so Lot saw what was happening. Lot, who was the nephew of Abraham, quickly took them in to their house, quickly took the angels in and said, whoa, please, these are my guests. Please do not hurt them. And the men said, no, bring them out. And Lot said, please, take my daughters instead. Which is messed up, but again, trying to stop them from graping, I guess we'll say, the angels. And so they said, no, we don't want your daughters, we want these men. Now, the angels had had enough by then. They said, get out of my way, Lot. Bam, they blinded them all with this divine light. And then they told Lot and his family, his wife and his two daughters, go and run and do not look back. Whatever you do, whatever you hear, do not look back. And so they ran and they ran. And of course, Lot's wife could not stand it. She had to look back and see what was happening to the city that she had come to love, that they had been in for so long. It had grown a part of them. Now keep this in mind because it's important. So she looked back and she turned into a pillar of salt. Lot and his two daughters were like, oh man, let's just keep going. I'm sure they were terrified, but They knew not to look back now for sure, even though the angels have warned them. So what happened? Well, they got to a cave, and where they lived in a cave for however long it was, just far away as they could get and protected from God's wrath. And so they stayed in this cave, and Lot's daughters, this is where it gets even more disturbing. Lot's daughters were mad because they were saying, well, how are we supposed to have someone to father our children now that God destroyed our great city? So they devised a plan where they would get their father Lot drunk, and when he was just about ready to pass out, they would lay with him. And they both did on separate nights, and they both became pregnant. God let them keep their children. God obviously was not happy with them. But this, again, part of the plan. They had to know that you have to understand that in the Old Testament especially, but really in all of our life, God is not going to stop us from pursuing evil. God is not going to stop us from all the evil things that we desire and we pursue. So he let Lot's grandchildren live, children and grandchildren, and they were called Moab and Ammon. Now, later in the Old Testament, the Moabites and the Ammonites became mortal enemies of the Israelites. They were a product of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they were corrupted to the core. The Amalekites, who we're focusing on, but you have to know why. So why did God destroy Sodom and Gomorrah? Why did God destroy the Amalekites? We see in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah how important it is that you destroy everyone. Because even the ones they said were righteous, the ones the angels let live, were still not righteous. In Noah's flood, when Noah and his family were the only ones allowed to live, they brought the corruption with them. If it would have been a complete reset, maybe it would have started out much better, but no, the old evil ways came with them. Children of abusive households, children of alcoholics can tell you, children who were sexually abused can tell you how that spreads. We look at the children of these people, and we see how often they become the exact same way. They will sexually abuse their children. They will become alcoholics and abusive themselves. It's not always like that, but we have a new covenant with God now. At this point in time, there were, I don't know, however many generations in 400 years at least. That was about the time that God let them fail on their own. The Old Testament was about the fall of man. It was about leading the Israelites, who were called the chosen people, not because they were some great people, because they fell into the same evilness and darkness that all of these enemies of Israelites also fell into. You have this corruption that spreads. And of course, we're like, why the children? Why? That makes no sense. And then there's one part where they're checking, they said the young girls if they were proven to be virgins, could live. Now, why would that be? That sounds just as sick as what the Amalekites and the Ammonites and the Moabites and the Canaanites did. They did this for a reason, because if they were virgins, they were still innocent of the crime. Now, the young boys, they would have that vengeance. They would grow up saying, you destroyed my people, I'm going to destroy you. The spirit of vengeance usually lives in young men. Young women, it's much different. Not saying that vengeance can't be, because everybody knows nothing like the vengeance of a woman scorned, right? But you have to connect the dots. You have to see the context. You have to understand why. Why? And obviously, I don't care if atheists don't agree with this, saying, your God is an evil God, look at all this. I don't care what atheists say. The reason I'm talking about this is I was confronted with it last night when I was doing a live stream. And it was already the time when I was going to get off there. My back was killing me. And of course, somebody asked, what do you do with the harder parts of the Old Testament? How do you view them? And I had thought a lot about this. I've studied this a lot. So I started to talk about it, and I thought it was a Christian or someone just asking this. It ended up being an atheist. That's fine. There was another guy on there who just kept egging me on, laughing about everything I said. And I was already to the point where my back was hurting so bad that I had to get off of there, but I wasn't going to get off until I started explaining a little bit. My mind wasn't working right. It takes hours, if not the rest of your life, to sometimes figure this out. It is not something I can say really quick on a live stream when I'm trying to end the live stream. But of course I tried, because I'm not the brightest person. And it didn't go horribly bad, because I was beginning to explain what I'm trying to explain today. And it just wasn't as clear as I'd like it to be. This video is nowhere near as clear as I would like it to be. When you are looking at the violence of the Israelites and God in the Old Testament, so many things must come into account. And again, God was letting man fail on his own. God was letting man come to the point where he was so corrupt and he was so lost that he was desperate for a savior. Desperate. Just like in our lives, we should be desperate for Jesus Christ when we finally understand the weight of our sins. We absolutely should be. But many people don't ever get to the point where they understand the weight of their sins. Many people never care, because they feel like the guy who was egging me on last night, who I probably should just block from the channel, because he's on there just trolling me all the time. They think they are their own God. They think they are the ones that are the moral and righteous leaders, and only their word goes. Because that, in a nutshell, is what we all think at some point in our life. We all think, even if we don't like ourselves, even if we hate ourselves, we think, I am the one who is the smartest. If everyone would just listen to me. Yeah, there are a couple things I don't know, sure, but for the most part, I know right from wrong. I know what is good and what is bad. I am my own God. I don't need no book to tell me. I don't need no God to tell me what to do. It is the height of arrogance. It is the height of stupidity, really. And it is what leads to people like Adolf, people like Stalin, people like Mao, and all of the evil dictators who reject Christianity, who reject any moral foundation, because they are the ones who are the arbiters of truth. You know, Stalin and Mao especially. Stalin had these gulags, and he absolutely rejected any kind of religion. He was as secular as could be. He was a communist, and Karl Marx was a Satanist. He was. He wrote love letters to Satan. It is an evil form of government, but every government is evil in at least some capacity, especially the United States. Not saying we're not any different. I shouldn't say especially. We all are, and the United States is no different. Okay, so I remembered why I was going to talk about how even outside of the Bible, God would wait hundreds of years before pouring his judgment out on an enemy. So the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Amalekites, the Moabites, all of these people, God waited until their entire society, their entire culture was just beyond redemption. No redeeming them. They have the evil inside of them to their core. Now this leads me to my last point I'm going to make, but I mentioned it earlier. Outside of the Bible, we saw the exact same thing happen when it was a little thing called the Crusades. Now the Crusades are always used by Christian haters against Christians, saying, look at how evil that was. Look at how bad these Christians were. They just killed these poor Muslims. It is awful. Wait, that's not following Christ. But wait a second. For hundreds of years before the Crusades, the Muslims were torturing, enslaving, and killing, taking over their land of all the Christians, all the non-Christians too, anyone. They were ruthless. They were evil. I'm not saying this about Muslims today. There are very great people who are Muslims today. Because again, the Christians didn't act Christian-like according to today's standards. But what are you supposed to do as a Christian? Are you supposed to just let it go? Yeah, the Muslims took over so much of our land, and they're probably going to take over the entire world if we just sit back and let them. But hey, Christ said turn the other cheek, right? No. Christ told us that self-defense is absolutely justified. Attacking someone in self-defense is absolutely justified. The only time violence is not justified is if you are using it as vengeance, revenge, in a way that is, you are the aggressor. If you are not the aggressor, violence is justified. He told his disciples to sell your cloaks and buy a sword. He did not tell them to be pacifists. Of course, he wants peace above all else. God teaches us that peace for sure. But in the Crusades, the Muslims were going to take over all of the world. They were. All the known world. It was non-stop, and they occupied the Holy Land of Jerusalem. They occupied so much land They were still sniping and going and taking more and more land of Christians and non-Christians alike. Was nobody to stop them? Was it not justifiable to stop them? What happened was something that had never happened before. In fact, it might have been the rise of Christianity, and maybe not in a good way, but the mainstream Christianity, because the churches, the Catholic Church, and all of the Christian nations, European mostly, they all came together, and they all, even though some of them despised each other, they all said, we must do something about this threat. We must join forces. As much as we don't get along for various reasons, we must join forces, and we must take care of this problem, or else there will be none of us left. Just like if God did nothing, if the Israelites did nothing, and just let the Canaanites, the Amalekites, the Amorites, the Moabites, on and on and on, if they let them go, let them do whatever they wanted to do, they would just, their corruption would spread. It had already spread into most of Israel. The Israelites were absolutely corrupted. We see it before and after, how the Israelites did not follow the word of God. Man is led by his flesh and desire all the time. We see it to this day. So, outside of the Bible, mirrored the Old Testament, where finally the Christians band together and they took down the Muslim forces. They just beat them down. And did they go too far? Yes, they did go too far sometimes. But was the war justified? I would say absolutely. If it was my call, and I hate war, I would say it is absolutely justified. If you lay down and don't protect your family, if you do not protect what you hold dear, then you are not doing God's will. You are not saying, oh, go ahead, take my family, do what you will to them, then kill us all. That is not what God wants. That is not what turn the other cheek means. It means if someone is being a jerk to you, or somebody even is aggressive with you, and it can be tamed with peace, turn that other cheek. Someone slaps you, bam, turn the other cheek. Now, someone is threatening to kill you or your family, you do not turn the other cheek. There is no other cheek to turn to. You will be dead, and everyone you love will be dead. So, these things I mentioned today, along with so much more that it would take me so long to get to, at least hours to even summarize, because God's covenant with us has changed. We do not follow the rules. We do not worship the covenant with God in the Old Testament. We do not. The covenant has changed. Many won't understand any of these things because it takes for you to dig deep. It takes for you to become enlightened. Again, this would have all sound like, my eyes would have rolled back in my head before I was saved. Because as the Apostle Paul said, the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. To those who are being saved, it is the power of God. Those who are perishing, those who attack you and say, what about the Amalekites? What about the Canaanites? What about slavery? What about fill in the blank in the Old Testament? Things like this, God was guiding slowly. God did not come down and rule as a dictator. God did not show his force. If God came down and showed himself in force, we would be slaves or we would be robots and we would be unneeded. Because God, who lives outside of space and time, can do anything, limited his powers, limited how much he intervenes in this world. And he did this because it is vital for us to have free will. It is vital for us to learn and either love him or not love him. There is no love without free will, and that is the most important thing. God is love. You see these verses and you're like, well, God was evil, but he might be love within Jesus Christ, but man, now he's evil. Or he was evil then, I mean. And it doesn't make any sense. If that's the same God, why is that? That was the same God. That was Jesus Christ, guiding in a very limited way. But you see why these things had to be done. It wasn't because he didn't love us. It wasn't because he didn't love the enemies. There are numerous times, even times where, like the Canaanites, they said, oh, well, why did he call for genocide of the Canaanites? He did not. If you read the original Hebrew, it says to drive out. It was war. Anyone who remained behind, they gave them a chance to run. There were Canaanites plenty mentioned after the attack on Canaan. He gave them a chance to run because the Canaanites were just as evil as all of his other enemies. The biggest thing and the most evil thing was the sacrifice of humans and children at the altar of their false gods. That was the biggest thing that you have to understand. That was from the beginning, from Abraham, what God warned against, that evil. And he let Abraham go up to the mountaintop, saying, you must go sacrifice your own son, Isaac, the son you waited 100 years to have with your wife, Sarah. You must take him to the altar on top of the mountain. You must sacrifice him. And so for 3 days and 3 nights, Abraham had to go walk up there. You know, probably Isaac was like, where's the sheep, Dad? Where's the sacrifice, Dad? What's going on here? But the whole time, Abraham was pleading with the Lord, please, anything but this, take me instead. It is awful, awful. That feeling he must have had where he was called on by God to sacrifice his own son, to sacrifice any human at all, but his own son, that hit close to home. And then he got up there, he tied Isaac down, and he lifted the knife, and an angel of God came down and stopped him. Why didn't God just say from the beginning, don't sacrifice children, don't sacrifice your own son? I will never tell you to sacrifice your own kid. The other gods will. I will not. The small g gods, the false gods, they will tell you this. Because almost everyone in society was doing this. In the world, the known world. Even the unknown world, the Mayans, the Incans, the Aztecs, they were all doing human and child sacrifice. You know, not to mention the sexual immorality that was, you know, thing that rhymes with grape and thing that rhymes with best. I don't know how to, it's not fun to talk about for sure. So why would God not just tell him, do not sacrifice your children? And if anyone says that I were calling for sacrificing children, they were wrong. Why shouldn't he put that on the old or the 10 Commandments? He did this because spending 3 days and 3 nights walking up in complete torment the mountain, that is where you feel the sting. That is where you feel, oh, this is why I don't sacrifice children. Because growing up, before the Lord came to Abraham Abraham and his wife Sarah's families, they were worshiping those false gods that sacrificed children all the time. So he had to know this. He had to be shown this without a shadow of a doubt. And the corruption that spreads from the cities. After Sodom and Gomorrah, only Lot and his 2 daughters survived because his wife looked back. Curious wife. But again, that curiosity was part of the corruption of Sodom. You see how that evil spreads if you let any living person go from there. Now, God did not send those children to hell. It says over and over and over again in the scriptures in the New Testament and Old that before the age of discernment, children will go to heaven. Well, they didn't say to heaven in the Old Testament, but they did in the New. In the Old Testament, they weren't talking about heaven and hell yet. They were talking about soul, the place of the dead. But they said that the children were innocent. And so Jesus' sacrifice was retroactive. So all the people in the Old Testament, all of those children who had to die because of the sins of generations, hundreds of years of their family and their society, they did not pay. They were in heaven. They did not know how to discern right from wrong. Now, again, I know I've gone long, and this is something that is not easily summarized, but there are so many layers and so many things you have to understand. So if you were having a debate with someone, let's say I was up debating someone. We'll take a nice atheist, Alex O'Connor. How am I able to explain to him the context and the layers of all of this in the form of a debate? It would have to be such a long form debate that it goes on for hours and hours and hours, and still an atheist is most likely, I'm not saying do not engage them. If you know this stuff, absolutely engage them if they're coming at you. I'm saying it's probably not going to do any good. What it is good to know these things for is so when a young Christian has questions about this, which is what I thought the question was about last night, I'm going to repost that whole thing. So if you guys want to go, the very last probably half an hour at least of it was me talking about this. A young Christian might get turned off by reading the Old Testament and seeing how God called to kill men, women, and children. What? Do not let something like this take you away from Jesus Christ. There are reasons why this had to happen. All of these, what we call atrocities in the 21st century, because we don't look at the context of it. We don't look at that. Do we call it atrocities when we took down Germany in the 1930s and 40s? Do we? Do we call it an atrocity? Now, I guess in a way I would, but Japan dropping the bombs on Japan. How many people did those 2 atomic bombs save? Now, again, I do not know, but there would have been fighting until the death if that didn't happen. They would have probably had every last man, woman, and child fighting non-stop because they did not surrender when Germany was defeated. So you think about the evil things that they did. And again, the U.S. is not innocent of, it's not what I'm saying. And that in the situation of World War II, yes, we were less guilty than the other. We weren't putting people into camps. We weren't having the mad scientists experiment, even though we literally let the mad scientists into our country to work for us after the war. So, but the overall corruption, the overall evil, it lasted, and it had to be wiped out. All right, everybody, I hope this helps. Please leave a comment. Let me know if it was good, wasn't good. Either way, that's fine. Let me know. I love you all so much. God bless.